that we've been feeling these last 9 days. Like you, I am. And among the many Schultziisms, and there were many, like the word reduplicate, which it made such sense when he said it, I had to look it up to see if it was a word. But there was another thing that he always used, a classic Schultziism, whenever we worked a big game like a Grey Cup or a Super Bowl. And he always used to talk about the need for every player to have a personal preparation package. And I always sort of smiled and chuckled a bit as he said it. I knew he meant it in a mental and emotional way. But all I could think of when he said it is Championship Sunday, and in comes the player, nervous, to the dressing room, to the stall, and there on the stool is a personal preparation package. And I used to think as he said it, what does he mean? What's in the package? Is there like a shaving kit, Advil, maybe a pack of Oreos? It would all be personal and different for every player. But he emphasized the need for preparation. And as such, I want to tell you the extent of my preparation and my personal preparation package, and I got to be honest, these will come in handy. And this will come in handy as it has all week. You've noticed the Sharpies around, and for those who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do, computers, no, not for Chris. This was the way to communicate, writing everything down, so in his honor I have made a few notes here. I did cheat a little bit later and go with the computer, I'm sorry. But just a few instructions, some housekeeping before we start. Please refrain from using cell phones, but if you must, make all of your calls by typing in all 10 digits each time because you couldn't bother by storing contacts. Please reply to all emails by starting a fresh chain because you couldn't be bothered figuring out the reply button. And please, please, no social media. But if you must, treat it like a personal conversation that no one else can see, especially when you're fighting with someone. You know, Chris Schultz was actually, all kidding aside, good with a phone. My last conversation with him just a few weeks ago was a very somber one, as fate would have it, talking about another loss, especially within the CFL and TSN community, of Tony Darchie, who had passed away of a heart attack on February 8th. And Chris was deeply moved and very hurt by that as well. And I think of that conversation, which went beyond talking about Tony, our dear friend, but also about life. And, he lectured me about, taking better care of myself as I got older, and I'll never forget that conversation. The other conversation happened 11 years ago, halfway through the Olympic Games of Vancouver 2010. Anyone who has had the privilege of being involved in working in Olympics could probably identify to this. It matters so much. It's such a stressful assignment. You work so hard, and about halfway through, you do tend to hit a lull. The stress starts to mount. You're not sleeping as much. You're worried if you're doing a good enough job. And it does kind of get to you, and I wonder if he had a sixth sense. He wasn't involved, but my hotel room phone rang, and I picked it up, and the voice at the other end of the line was absolutely unmistakable. Like, Roddy, Schultz here! And I was, hey, Chris, what's going on? How you? Don't talk, just listen. I think you're doing a fabulous job, but you got to keep going. You got to keep your energy up. You got to keep preparing. You got to keep working. You got to get your rest. You got to eat right. You got to go to bed early. No staying out late. This went on. It made me feel like I was getting coached. It made me feel like I was playing football again and getting a very stern but loving lecture at the same time. And then, after about a minute, he said, proud of you, okay? And then he hung up the phone. And that was it. And I never had a chance to talk, and I didn't have a chance to say goodbye. And I got to be honest with you. I mean, there's a humorous part of it, but also by the same time, I've tried really hard this week not to see that phone call as a metaphor of some kind. Because it's a natural thing to want to, you have those regrets about wishing that you stayed in touch with him more and checked in more, and as he would often do. And I will say this about Chris, though, as we all knew. He wanted it to be about you. He didn't want it to be about him. I'm not even sure how he'd feel about this day. But you know what? I am so grateful that today is all about Chris Schultz. And I'm going to probably cry, and I'll definitely laugh, and I'm going to enjoy hearing lots of stories and tell you a few stories as well. You know, most of us here can only think of him one way: big. The gentle giant who stood 6'8". Very few are here that know Chris Schultz so much better than that: family. I'd like to begin now by introducing his big brother Mark and his little sister Monica.
So first, we'd like to say thank you to everybody for joining us. And for those of you who are joining us virtually, thank you for spending your time with us. And we're here today to have a few tears, but also a lot of laughs in honor of our brother who we love beyond measure. And so I'm going to be privileged to stand before you and talk about Chris as our little brother and our big brother. And I wanted to make sure that Mark had an opportunity to stand with me, at least for a few minutes, in honor of him. Okay. So, as of now, all of you who I have not had the privilege of meeting, you now know that I am Chris Schultz's little sister. And I will tell you that no matter how old I get, or where I live, or what happens to me, I will always think of myself as his little sister. We all have moments in our lives that we can call the best, and we have the ones that we can call the worst. And although this is definitely one of, if not the worst moment of my life today, I'm here to tell you about our brother and how he has given me some of the best moments of my life. I don't think I'm alone in that sentiment, and this may be exactly how some of you are feeling in this moment. Together we are here because of Chris, and to honor him by remembering some of the best moments of our lives that we either had with him or because of him. Chris leaves a legacy of achievements on the gridiron and in the studio, and if I took time now to tell you about them all, we would be here well into the evening. I know all of you know about those achievements. But more than trophies and plaques on a wall, Chris leaves behind a legacy of kindness, thoughtfulness, humility, friendship, charisma, and so much more, and most of you know about that. Over the last few days, Mark, his wife Ruth, and I have been blessed to hear story after story after story of Chris's generosity. We have heard so many tales of how Chris was there for someone who was going through a hard time because their parent died, or because they were a victim of domestic violence, or of him driving people to and from the hospital, or driving people to and from chemotherapy treatments. About how Chris convinced a young man that he needed to go to university, and he did. How he helped my friends' children when they were struggling and took the time to sit down with them at Tim Hortons and talk to them and give them some guidance. Although we knew Chris his entire life, this part of him was more than even Mark and I knew about. He did these things not for the applause and not for the roar of the crowd and not to win a game. He just stepped in and stepped up and supported and helped people just because that is who he was. Everyone we have encountered said Chris was their friend. But what you don't know, and what Mark and I only know, is Chris is our brother. And I wanted to be sure that before our lives move on without Chris in them, that before we move into this huge void that's left in our lives, that you all know a little bit more about the middle child of the Schultz family. So just as a little background, all three of us were first-generation Canadians with parents who immigrated to Canada after the Second World War. I'm pretty sure that the last name of Schultz gave the heritage away, and I will tell you that Chris's desire to play football and how he dedicated himself to the sport from a very early age perplexed our German parents. To be honest, Mom and Dad weren't really sure what to do with their son, who talked about things like Pac-10 schools and athletic scholarships and pro football. Now, I'm the youngest, so Mark had a few more years with Chris than I did. And it was in those first 4 years of Chris's life that Chris's passion and commitment to football actually started, even that young of a child. The family moved into Burlington in 1966, and this also meant that all of a sudden Mark and Chris had 7 TV stations to watch, and that was the first time Chris saw a CFL and an NFL football game on television. Mark told me a story about how they watched a game between Ottawa and Saskatchewan, and they watched Chris become enthralled with the fullback George Reed. Chris said he wanted to be George Reed, and this was likely the first clear hint of the direction that Chris's life would take. Even at that age of 5 or 6, Chris said he was going to be a football player, and his dedication to achieving that goal never wavered. A few years later, Chris's career began at the age of 8 with the Brandt Chrysler Plymouth Flag football team. And believe it or not, Chris started out as a running back. His first goal was achieved. He played the same position as George Reed. Now, I know I was taken to many of a Burlington alignment football games, which was also one of Chris's teams, and I was way too young to understand what was happening on the field. And I liked to cheer for the opposite team because it was more fun to say, "Go Leli Lions." As Chris moved through Tyke, Pee-wee, Bantam, it became obvious he wasn't built to be a running back, and he moved into the positions in the defensive line. This was true when Chris eventually got to high school and played football for Aldershot. Now, for Chris playing football, he had to grow and he had to gain weight, and again, he dedicated himself to this goal. He consumed gallons of a concoction called Weight Gain Formula Number 7. I've tried it. I don't recommend it. He naturally was a person who also didn't shy away from food. As I mentioned, our family was of German descent, and we would sometimes have potato pancakes for dinner. And these were made from scratch. And if any of you know potato pancakes, that was a lot of work for our mom to do to make dinner for a family of 5. Then one night, the pancake eating contest of all time ensued between Mark and Chris. And the contest only ended when our mother ran out of potatoes. So, how many pancakes do you think Chris ate versus Mark? Who won the contest? Well, it might surprise you to know that Chris ate 16 and Mark ate 18. So Chris lost by a safety. But you got to remember, Mark was 3 years older than Chris at the time. So our poor mom had a tough time keeping up with the appetites of her 2 boys, and Chris definitely contributed to that strife. Often groceries were brought in on a Friday, and a day later, all of the fruit was gone. Mark said they even made our poor mother cry a few times over this. I personally remember my mom packing our lunches for school, and she packed Chris's in like a full-size grocery bag, and Mark's and mine in a normal lunch bag. So I need to say that if I wanted any food, I would have to eat it out of the grocery bag as it was coming out of the car into the house, or else I would be gone. So now I was also lucky that I had 2 brothers who tolerated a little sister hanging around, and I loved it when they let me play with them. The boys, as they were called, had a football game where you plugged it in and the metal would vibrate and the plastic football players would jump around on the board, and they didn't like it. So what they did is they invented the teddy bear football team. And each of our teddy bears had a position on the team. So this is the quarterback, Davy Davis. And this is our running back, Barry Bear. And I even have a picture of the football team if you want to see it. Championship League. Now, the teddy bear football team would play against their arch rivals, the Dolls and Ducks. And yes, any dolls I ever had were recruited to the Dolls and Ducks team and were annihilated by the teddy bear football team. Mark, as the oldest, got to coach and lead the teddy bear football team and made Chris coach the always losing Dolls and Ducks. But Chris made sure that his teddy bears performed well for the team and scored all of the points, and the Dolls and Ducks usually lost by like 75-0. Believe it or not, Chris wasn't just talented as a football player and a commentator. He had a secret talent. He and I took horseback riding lessons together and even showed horses together. Yes, Chris at one time was an equestrian. I bet not a lot of you knew that one. Now, I'm tall, but obviously nothing compared to Chris. And we have pictures of Chris on our horse with his legs hanging so low, so close to the ground, that the joke was if the horse fell down, Chris would just get up and walk away. And again, Chris was always one to step in and step up and help out. And that included the barn where he mucked stalls, swept down cobwebs, and brought in tons of hay every year for the Rapsons. We have heard and read a lot over the last few days about Chris and how one thing amongst many that have been mentioned over and over is how prepared Chris would be. Whether it would be for a football game or in the TSN control room, ready to go on air, he was always, always prepared. And that is something that has always been a part of Chris. The habit of preparation started very young. When Chris was 13 and completely focused on football, he would take the bus to do his gym, go work out, and then take the bus home. And just think, at 13, he already had that drive and determination and understanding that to achieve his goal, he was going to have to prepare, and that included lifting weights at the age of 13. Chris had an incredible ability to understand and use his mental focus to achieve throughout his entire life. Again, remember, he set goals of being a football player at the age of 6. I remember seeing a high school yearbook where someone had written on the cover page, "Maybe I will see you in the NFL one day." And Chris had taken something sharp and scratched out the word maybe, and it said, "I will see you in the NFL one day." We have also heard a lot about Chris's kindness and compassion. I remember him taking me tobogganing as a very small child, and I promptly slid down the hill into a creek and became all wet. And he dragged me home from that tobogganing run with me wet and cold and crying the whole time. He always, always looked out for me, and he still does to this day. Once when I had a bad car accident, he was the first person I called. And without question or hesitation, after knowing I was okay, he left Burlington and picked me up in Mississauga, middle of the night, no questions asked. Now, Chris and I are brother and sister, so we didn't always get along. We do fight. And I remember getting so mad at Chris that I would start wanting to hit him. And all he would do is he would hold out that arm and hold me here, and I'd be swinging at air, and I'd be so mad and so frustrated until that adorable, charming, magnetic grin showed up. And then I would just break out laughing, and that would be that. We were in high school together for 1 year. We'd hop the back fence to catch the bus. I was a gummer, and he was in grade 12. During my year in high school with Chris, I sometimes couldn't remember what my name was because I was constantly referred to as Schultz's sister. What I do remember is that Chris was kind to everyone. I distinctly remember him at the lockers talking with a boy who was one of those kids who was treated harshly at school, was the outcast and teased. We all remember what high school was like. But Chris would always talk to and be kind to everyone. He never had an ego. But all the time while he was in high school, he did have his goals set, and the first step after playing for Aldershot was a scholarship. One of my favorite memories of Chris, and one that exemplifies his focus to his goals and dedication to what he wanted to achieve, was that, with our mother's permission, who said, as long as you call home regularly and are here in time for school on Monday, he took buses from Ontario, Canada, to Michigan and walked into the athletic office of the Michigan State Spartans, unannounced, with no appointment, and said, "I'm Chris Schultz, and I want to play for your team." I can only imagine the coaches were floored to see some skinny kid from Canada with an accent just show up on their doorstep and start telling them that he was their next team member. But Chris told me that they were very impressed with his determination. They took some time to tour him around, and they made sure he got back on the bus in time to be at school on Monday. He did that twice. He did that again to Syracuse. Chris obtained his goal and went away to the University of Arizona on a football scholarship. Nowadays, it's pretty easy for universities to find talent with the media that we have. Back then, Chris had to go out and promote himself. And after a sequence of events, he actually received a full scholarship to the University of Arizona. and that was quite an accomplishment for a Canadian kid to get a scholarship to a Pac-10 university. Chris was a pioneer. Again, so many stories and memories to be had for Chris's life during his days in Arizona, like him coming home from holidays on crutches after having surgeries on both ankles. And he promptly went with Mark to stand in line from 2 a.m. to 11 a.m. to get Bruce Springsteen tickets. And he didn't even get to go to the concert because he had to go back to school. Jim Grossman is a friend of Chris's that met Chris at university when they were both freshman football players, and they've remained close to this day. Jim couldn't be here today, but he told me a story of meeting Chris during their training camp at Arizona and how they basically grew up together while at school and had a lot of fun doing it. And one of the things Jim told me last week was that Chris had built a shrine to the Dallas Cowboys in his dorm room. And he was telling everybody, I'm going to play for America's team. And everybody said, yeah, sure. Come on, Chris, we got to get to class. But you know what? Again, Chris put a goal in front of him, and he achieved it, and he was drafted by the Cowboys in the 7th round. That skinny German kid from Canada who used to play teddy bear football went with his brother, made America's team. So what I'm going to do now is turn back over to Rod so he can now bring you into what I'm calling the second and third quarter of Chris's life.
Thank you, Monica. Yes, as a Canadian who played some university football, I knew the name well, and I knew how rare it was for a Canadian to be able to make it in the National Football League. Without ever knowing him, without meeting him, it'd be years before I'd get that chance, was very proud to see him make the Dallas Cowboys. And I was equally proud to get the opportunity to finally meet him after he came up to the Toronto Argonauts. In 1986, it was about 4 years later, as a reporter, a young reporter, younger, for TSN. And I'm a handshake guy, and it's torture, seeing all of you and just wanting to shake your hands. And because of COVID, we're not really supposed to do that sort of thing. And when I think of Chris, I think of a handshake. And I've been blessed with what I thought were big hands. And I remember first meeting him, I wanted to do an interview in the 1990 Argonauts, and shaking his hand, and I thought, oh my goodness, because my hand was gone. He could, and I'm sure he could have crushed stone with it. But he gave really good answers too, not just your standard cliches, one day at a time. He thought about what you asked, and that always made an impression upon me. And it made me think that he had a future in the media. And he's certainly known for his time at TSN, but it should be pointed out that Chris Schultz's roots in his second career after his playing days were in radio. He started in radio, and he ended, as it turned out, in radio as well, full circle in his broadcast career. And there is one man more responsible for getting him started in his second career from a famous football player to a famous media personality than this man I'm about to introduce. Please welcome Mike Hogan.
Thank you, Rod. When the speaking order was announced, I was thinking, oh, I don't have to follow pinball. But I found out very quickly that you've made it really tough for me to follow you. Monica, great job. I want to thank the Schultz family and friends and colleagues for allowing me to speak here today. As Rod mentioned, I guess I'm kind of representing the portion of Chris's life between player and TV pretty boy, which was a difficult road to travel. What I am going to do here, though, is I'm going to steal from Mike Clements, because if you have not seen Mike speak before, and he will be speaking later, Mike has a great ability of being able to take a snippet or a quote from somebody and incorporate it into a speech, whether it be in front of a crowd or even on our football operations meetings, and be able to hit home with that. So it might be a quote from Dr. King. It might be a snippet of a poem from Maya Angelou. It might be an inspirational quote from Vince Lombardi. So knowing Chris, I thought I would start this with a quote from somebody he spent his adult life listening to, gaining words of wisdom from, and guidance in the process. And I quote, "Back in Black I hit the sack. I've been too long. I'm glad to be back. From AC/DC, who meant as much to Chris as anybody I can think of. How was that, Pinball? Is that the kind of thing you were going for? Okay, perfect. I thank you for the laughter, forced as it may be, because we've all cried too much this week, and I wanted to hear that. So I thought now maybe turning to my Irish heritage as opposed to the German heritage and celebrating the life while mourning at the same time. I first met Schultz in September of 1993. I was a host at the Fan 590, and I was working an afternoon shift. And to put this in perspective, that month we were celebrating as a radio station our 1-year anniversary in 1993. That station's been around forever. And we were still a month away from hearing our colleague Tom Cheek say, "Touch 'em all, Joe." So Chris and I go way back, and I was doing this afternoon shift, and one of our producers, an Argo fan by the name of Chris Clark, said, "I want you to try out a couple of guys as radio hosts who are football players. They're looking for a post-career career, and they both think broadcasting might be it for them." So the two players he brought in that day were Chris Schultz and a defensive player named Brian Warren. Both were great players. Both were from the University of Arizona, and both were at the tail end of their career. Chris had blown out his knee in 1993 in the first game of the season in Edmonton. So he was going to miss that season. He knew it. And he did not want to walk off the field, or leave the field, the playing surface, for the last time on a golf cart. He wanted to leave the sport in his own terms. So he was going to go back in 1994 and play. So he came in with Brian Warren. And Brian Warren had great pipes. He had this deep, smooth, resonant voice that made Rod sound like he had been sucking helium from balloons for about an hour. Now Chris didn't have that voice. He had a great voice, but he didn't have Brian Warren's voice. So if you were listening to this show for the first time, there is no way you were drawn to Chris's voice because of Brian Warren. You were listening to that. How can I put Brian's voice properly? If Barry White's voice and James Earl Jones' voice had a baby, it would be Brian Warren's voice. It was silky smooth and a tough act for him to follow. Brian would eventually become a broadcaster on Argo games and has been a preacher, and he's been able to use this gift. Schultz went back and played. And while this was going on, the show Football Friday, then Football Sunday, had started. The first year was Leo Cahill and myself. Leo liked the show, but he was moving, so he wasn't able to commit. Lance Chomak, a teammate of several of you in here, and a teammate of Chris's, came in. And then at the end of the 94 season, Lance was so good, our competitor AM 640, who had the broadcast rights, asked Lance to be the color voice, which left an opening. So in the summer of 1995, I needed a broadcast partner for Football Sunday. And I don't know how it happened. I can't remember whether there was any conversation that included me or not. All I know is Chris Schultz was our partner, and it was life-changing for both of us. Chris was always prepared for a broadcast with the Sharpie. He took copious notes and was able to share them and was super prepared. And I took note of that because I'm thinking, okay, for a football show, for a 2-hour radio show, Chris would come in with this binder filled with Sharpie notes. And I'm thinking, he played D1. He started in the NFL. He was a multiple-time All-Star in the CFL. And he's this well prepared? Dude, you better pick up your game. And I took that. And, I went from being, I thought, prepared to being up here in terms of preparation. And that's totally Chris Schultz. Totally Chris Schultz. So Schultz starts as a radio guy. He's got a lot going for him. He's got the background, he's got the knowledge, he's got the enthusiasm, he's got the preparation down. But there was one thing that kept Chris Schultz from being a star broadcaster from the very first time he turned on a microphone. He was terrified of the microphone. Terrified. And you talked about how, kind of didn't really want to go out there and speak. He was terrified. Now, you might not be like Rod and have attended a great university like Ryerson and gone through that program and learned about the background of broadcasting, or James Duthie at Carleton with an internationally respected journalism program, or been like me who took 1 year of radio at Loyalist College. But you don't have to have that background to realize that a broadcaster being afraid of a microphone is not good. There's a bit of a problem that's got to be overcome here. So I realized that I had to do anything in my power to help Chris get to that next stage of his career. I was going to be that guy. It would benefit him. It would benefit me. It would benefit the radio station to see the Chris Schultz that I was getting to know off the air translate to become Schultzy on the air. And during one show early on in one of our first programs together, I get an idea. This is going to work. This is going to work fantastic. I've got to be able to get Chris Schultz to lighten up on the air. I think I've got a plan. So we go to a commercial break, and I leave the studio, the little radio studio. There's a plexiglass between where the producer and the technical director sit and where Chris and I were sitting in the studio. So Chris was sitting here. I was sitting to his left. And I say, Schultz, you just hang on. I'm going to go out. I've got to go out and talk to the producer. I'll be right back. Okay. You get the Sharpie. Keep preparing for that excitement. So I say to our technical director, says, commercial's winding down. We're going to start in 10 seconds. I say, oh, I know. He said, Schultz, he's in there by himself. I know. I want to see how Chris is going to react to this. So, smart idea, right? This is going to get him to laugh at himself. So the commercial starts, or ends, and the music to bring us back on starts. Schultzy's got his head down, and it clicks in. Hogan's not in his chair. He looks at the plexiglass for guidance or a parachute, and I'm sitting here like this. Then I learned what it was like to be an opposing defensive lineman when Chris was playing on the offensive line, because he looked at me with a death stare. And he went, I was in that chair with more speed than Rocket Ismail and more dexterity than Mike Clemens. I was like that. So we talked about it afterwards. And I never put Chris in that situation again. But when we did talk afterwards, I said there was a reason I did that. And it was to make you a better broadcaster. And it was to make this a better show. We've got to get you to that point somehow. It's going to come, but we've got to get you somewhere. Get you there somehow. And it came down to one word, and it's a word that I think Schultz valued as much as any other, and it was trust. Very simple word, one syllable, 5 letters. But it was perhaps the most valued word in his vocabulary, which we know could be unique at times. Trust was the important trait that Schultz was looking for in a teammate, because he was prepared. We know his preparation and everything that he did. And he had to look at Dan Ferroni next to him, and he had to be able to trust Dan and look down the line, Jim Kardash or Randy Ambrosi or Beckstead or Prunster or Skemp or Schmidt or any of the great players that he was affiliated with on that spectacularly talented offensive line. He had to trust them. He had to trust that behind him, Dwayne Ford or Pinball or whoever at running back or fullback is going to do their job. He had to trust that the quarterback was going to do his job. He had to trust that Paul Masadi or Rocket or somebody was going to be able to get downfield, be on the same page as the quarterback, make that catch, not give up the football. He had to trust them. And when he got the trust from a player, you were in. It was the same thing as a colleague. And when we went through that episode of me hanging him out to dry, when we got past that, there was that trust. He had to have the trust with his teammate, with his fellow broadcaster. He had to develop a trust with Rod and James and Jock and everybody on the panel. He had to do that. And once you did, once he opened up that giant wingspan of his and invited you in, you had a friend for life. You're here today. There are a lot more people who wanted to be here today. You're here today as family, as friends, as colleagues, as teammates, because you were able to develop that trust with Chris. And that meant the world to him. I'm going to miss him. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Personal preparation package here. So well put and so true about being in Schultz's world. And I do thank you, and I also thank you for one other thing. We already knew each other, and after a Vanier Cup sometime in the mid-'90s, not sure 96, 97, I had already met Chris Schultz, the player, as I talked about. I hadn't met Chris Schultz, the broadcaster, yet in a different, more relaxed setting. And Mike and Schultz had worked the Vanier Cup on the radio side. I had worked the Vanier Cup on the TV side. We happened to meet up at Alice Fazzuli's restaurant after that, and they were there, and Mike had a chance to meet Schultz again and talk to him just one-on-one away from the football stadium. And he expressed an interest in trying television as well, the first time he mentioned that. And as said, even going back further than the impression he made in radio as a player, I could just tell there was just something about him that made me think he would be good at it. But it was my understanding, I only learned this week, that one of our bosses, Paul Graham, had approached him back when he was just starting out in radio, and he had turned down the chance to even audition for TV because he didn't feel ready, and I think he liked what he had going with Mike and wanted to stay with it. But I had hosted the CFL panel, which was still in its fledgling years in 1997, getting going and establishing an identity, but they were going to make a lot of changes after the 97 season. I was going to get a chance to call some games on the road, and they were going to change up the panel completely. And one of the last things I did as the panel host, outgoing panel host, was to conduct the auditions with all these prospects. John Hines, our senior CFL producer, was also in charge of those auditions. And we remember that in early 1998, a bunch of people coming in. Some good prospects there, but there was one who stood out. And I'm not even talking about in a physical sense. He just stood out. The aura about him, the way he dealt with questions, the way he answered, the way he projected, the way he communicated, it was like magic. And John Hines and I talked afterwards, and we knew one thing. He was ready. He didn't feel ready before, but he was ready then. And so too was the next host of the CFL on TSN. Like me, an Ottawa boy. And they hired him out of Vancouver, and I didn't know anything about him at the time, but boy, when I look back, that wasn't a bad hire. That kind of worked out. And what is really interesting, another thing I thought about this week, is those two men made their debut with TSN and the same day, at the very same moment, in the season opener of Canada Day 1998. Please welcome James Duthie.
Thank you, Roddy. And these two guys are far too humble to say it, but Schultz, I know how much he appreciated having these two guys bookend his career. The first guy he worked with in radio, doing that audition, and then at the end of his career. Two guys who shared his passion for football and were unbelievably compassionate to Schultz in his life and to his family over the last 10 days. So I know he'd really appreciate it. So I walk into the Westin Prince Hotel on this early summer day in 1998, and I'm terrified. As Rod mentioned, I've just gotten hired to host what felt like a massive show, CFL on TSN. I didn't know anybody. And the first guy who walks in, as I'm waiting in the lobby, we're trying to find a room. They're having the big preseason CFL on TSN meeting. And the big man is the first guy I recognize. He walks in the door. He's unmistakable. And I recognize him, but he doesn't recognize me. I kind of go, Schultz! And he gives you that look before he's let you in, that not quite trusting look. And I said, it's James. Still doesn't trust. I said, James Duthie, I'm the guy who's going to be hosting the panel with you. And right away, that transformation to that giant smile that Monica was talking about and Hoagie was talking about, and he does the big the bro handshake, and the bro lean-in hug, and cracked 2 of my ribs. But I think we bonded right away because we were rookies, and we were in the same boat. I'd been a sportscaster, but I'd never hosted a national show. He'd done radio, but had never done TV. And so we were in the trenches together. And he was dynamite from the first night. Keith Pelly used to run TSN, and he stepped out of his executive office and into the producing chair that night. And he emailed me this week and said, I kept telling you guys to look at the camera and not each other when you were talking. And Schultz was the only one who got it right away. You and Tillman sucked. But there were bumps in the road. And I'm going to tell a story that I told a couple of times this week, so many of you may have heard it. But I want to tell it again because Schultz loved the story. And we'd be at Super Bowls 15 years later, and he'd say, James, tell the earpiece story. So Schultz did not want to wear the earpiece, which is a critical part of being on television. He said, quote, I got too many voices in my head already. But John Hines and Paul McLean and Keith Pelly, the main producers, kept saying, Schultz, if you're ever going to get good at this job, you have to wear the earpiece. So I don't know if it was a week in or 2 weeks in or 4 games in. He finally puts the earpiece in. Paul McLean was producing in the studio that night. Paul tried not to talk to him too much. In fact, I think the first half we didn't talk to him. But we ended up doing a panel right before the kickoff of the second half. And Schultz was talking a little bit too long. And we were going to miss the kickoff. And so Mac had no choice but to get in his ear and say, Schultz, shut up, get it back to James, we're going to miss the kickoff. And this is what came out on air, I'll be Schultz. If the Argos are going to get back in this game in the second half, they have to establish a running game. Shut up, Schultz, get it back to James, we're going to miss the kickoff. He said exactly what Paul said in his ear. And we laughed. And he was probably embarrassed that night and for a while, but when you become one of the best analysts on either side of the border, which he did, you can become self-deprecating and laugh about it. And Heinze said it in an email last week. He was the face of football on TSN for 2 decades. So you can afford to go back and laugh at your early mistakes. And laughing, there are a few guys that made me laugh, like Schultz made me laugh. I used to do these silly pieces. And we did a piece about how, just pure satire, how offensive linemen were angry that hockey players were starting to wear high numbers, their numbers, in the 60s and 70s, which became a trend in hockey. So we went out and got Schultz's 66 Cowboys jersey and a Mario Lemieux 66 Penguins jersey. And I said, Schultz, here's what I want you to do. Just act like you're really mad. You don't know who this guy is, and he's wearing your number. And I said, just roll the cameras. So Schultz goes, this is my number for the Dallas Cowboys, 66. Who is this Lemonex guy? And why is he wearing my number? And to this day, I don't know how he looked at LEMIEUX and got Lemonex. But it was gold. And it brings me a little piece of joy and comfort that the woman he spent the last year with, his girlfriend, Mary Ellen, last name is Lemieux. So you will always be Lemonex to me. I hope that's okay. He had a way with words. He'd make them up, as Hoagie said. Nicknames. He would give the crew nicknames, the camera guys. I'm glad Rennie is here today to represent them because the crew loved Schultz. There was Matt, who was there from near the beginning. Schultz meets Matt, the cameraman. What's your name? Matt. Matt, rat, hat, fat. He just starts rhyming, and I think he settled on Matt, fat, rat. Arthur. He saw Arthur walking back to the studio, another cameraman, with yogurt. He said, I'm calling you Yogurt. And then my favorite was Braden, poor Braden. Braden was there from the very beginning, 98 when we started, I think. And he was young and had long hair and I think a nose ring or an earring. And we all know how clean-cut Schultz was. So the first time he talks to Braden, he says, hey, you, drug boy. And for the next 2 decades, Braden was Drug Boy. And look, these are not the nicest nicknames, but the camera guys love them because it was Schultz's way of saying, you're on my team, I like you, right? We all know his passion for football and for broadcasting, but he was passionate in life and in relationships. I think I have exclusive knowledge of the fact that to at least one woman, Mary Ellen, this was years ago, so forgive me, he wrote extremely romantic, passionate emails. Like, your eyes are beautiful. Can we just get a coffee? I just want to sit across from you and look into your eyes. I don't know if he was trying to woo her or woo her back. The reason I know this is because he sent them to me by mistake. I received about 3 over a 1-month span. And I'm reading these things and going, I mean, Schultz, I love you, but I'm married. And finally, I didn't know what to do, so I finally replied and said, hey, Schultz, be careful with the address on the email, because you're sending these to me instead of, as well as, I don't know. And if it was me, I would have been horrified. Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed, I can't believe this. In typical Schultz fashion, his response was, okay, thanks. That was it. I don't know if I've ever laughed more. I don't know if there's been a greater character in all of the years at TSN, just larger than life in so many ways. But I don't want all of that to overlook what a character human being he was. Dave Naylor did a wonderful video eulogy on TSN last week, and I loved seeing the video from the Dallas Cowboys. John Madden and Pat Summerall talking about this improved kid, 66. But there was a piece of video that stuck out to me more than that, and I'd seen it 50 times, but never really seen it. And it was the Argos winning the Grey Cup, Schultz's Grey Cup. And they have the ball, and the clock hits 0. Matt Dunnigan snaps it and takes a knee. And the Argos all go crazy and start jumping up and down, as they should. And this is probably the pinnacle moment of Schultz's career. And they're all jumping up and down, and the one guy who isn't is 67. He turns immediately and extends his hand to 2 of the guys on the other team. Good game. Great job. And I was thinking, what does it say about a man that in your finest moment, the first thing that you think of is the other guys in their worst moment? And that was Schultz. We did a podcast this week. The 3 hosts that he had on TSN, Rod and I, and Dave Randorf with Donovan Bennett. Donovan asked us at the end if there was one more thing we could say to Schultz, what would it be? I just cried, I think. It was a terrible answer, but part of it would be, I wish you could hear everything that people said about him these last 9 days, because I don't know that he knew how many lives he impacted. But I think in the end, I would probably just extend my hand and say, great job, and we love you.
Thank you for that, JD. Again, so true. The reaction to Chris's passing when the news got out was overwhelming, especially on social media, especially on Twitter. And the irony wasn't lost on me then, because Schultz didn't exactly have a great relationship with Twitter. I can remember one tweet in particular because, as referred to earlier, I think he thought it was just between him and whoever he was arguing with, who might have insulted some of his analysis. And suddenly, I mean, Dennis and I would talk about this, we'd see a tweet, and it would just say, "Hey, John G., grow a brain." And we're thinking, does he know that everybody is, anyway, so that was Chris on social media, and yet the outpouring, the reaction was incredible. I've never seen anything like that going through all the mentions, it just took me too long to get through it all. And all talking about, the characteristics that Monica talked about, that Hoagie talked about, that James talked about as well. And among all those tributes, there's only one right now, I could read so many, but one I do want to read. James and I got an email a little later on. It's from a former sales rep at TSN from years ago. His name is John Lynn. And I want you to have a listen to this, how moved he was. It was all about a sales pitch when they were trying to sell Friday Night Football. He writes, "A presentation was set up at the agency with the client. We prepared all of the media research and data in slide form and thought it was very slick. As we were presenting it, from body language and a sixth sense, I knew we were not getting through, especially to the client. Fortunately, Chris Schultz came along to help us out and show an on-air personality. Chris then took over. He threw a couple of footballs around the boardroom and then talked passionately about football, the CFL, and the fans. The client and agency people were in the palm of his hand. On the way out after the meeting, Chris asked, 'How did we do?' And I replied that our presentation fell flat, but that he saved the day and they made the booking. And after that, they committed to Friday Night Football for several years. It was not the sales team, but Chris Schultz that closed that order. And of course, he just laughed and was so happy to have contributed. He wanted no fanfare or recognition, which was so much deserved. It was not a chore for him to participate in something like this beyond his broadcast duties." I thought that was wonderful to hear about the influence he could have. He could have quite an influence and make quite an impact on people through speaking. He could also, if you look back at some old YouTube video, make quite an impact on a defensive end as well. And I did do a little bit of that, looking back, the aforementioned 1985 Dallas Cowboy video on YouTube, 1987 Grey Cup in particular, that team that came so close to winning it all, losing, I think, in the final minute to Edmonton. And that offensive line was a very good offensive line. Chris Schultz, the strong left tackle. They had a pretty good right guard, as I recall, as well. And that man went on to become the commissioner of the Canadian Football League 30 years later, and he is here today. Please welcome a former teammate of Schultz's, Randy Ambrosie.
Well, Rod, thanks very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be here and have a chance to reflect on our friend Chris, Sue, Monica, and Mark. Chris was a truly remarkable person, and that we are all certainly proud to have known. On behalf of the Canadian Football League, I bring my condolences to all of you, because we know that Chris will be missed in all of your lives. I met Chris for the first time in the locker room at Exhibition Stadium after I'd been traded to the Argos in 1987. And I walked into the locker room for the first time, which for those of you who have played, that's quite an experience. It's intimidating. And Dan Ferroni was sitting in his locker having a cigarette. And Chris came over, as Chris would, and extended his hand and said hello. And he had that smile that became so, fundamental to who Chris was. And of course, going through the 2 seasons I played, you get to know your teammates in such a great way. But some of the things that, we're hearing, the word commitment and dedication are certainly synonymous with what, with what Chris was all about. In that 1987 Grey Cup game, we were attempting a field goal, and Lance Chomik was slightly wide to the left, and it landed in the arms of Henry Gizmo Williams. And Gizmo, as Gizmo was inclined to do, took off. And I talk about the issue of dedication, or maybe the lack of dedication. Gizmo went past Ferroni and I so quickly that Dan and I just opted to head straight to the bench. And by the time Giz was actually in the end zone, Dan and I were already sitting having a glass of water. But there was Chris, Big Chris, and Kelvin Prunster. Neither one of them had a snowball and heck's chance of catching Gizmo, but the two of them chased the Giz all the way into the end zone, and Dan and I were having a glass of water. But it was great to be Chris's teammate because he loved the game. He loved the game of football. And that was the thing that just struck me as I reflected on Chris's life on hearing the news of his passing, is he just loved the game that much. And the stories about how he came to play the game and the goals that he set for himself, those were things that were obvious. You may not have known those stories, but watching Chris operate, you could see that level of passion and dedication to the game. So you fast forward, your careers come and you move on to other elements of your life. And then to see Chris emerge as a TV personality. And at first you thought, oh my gosh, that's Chris Schultz. I know that guy. But what I was struck by was it just seemed so odd to me because Chris was quiet. Chris was a fundamentally quiet person. He was actually, I would say in some respects, he was very shy. And now you're watching him on national TV, larger-than-life personality, and you're listening to his analysis. And at first, it took me a while to reconcile. Maybe there was another Chris Schultz that I wasn't familiar with, but it was Chris, and he had, again, by virtue of his love of the game and his dedication to being the best that he could be, he put that shyness behind him. And I can now, through listening to the stories about the camera guys and the nicknames, you could see Chris in that because he definitely loved the people that were around him. And I don't know what it is about being a tackle, but tackles have the unique capability of inventing language because before Chris in the CFL, there was Chris Walby. And Chris Walby, working for CBC at the time, but Chris invented words all the time. And then it just seemed like Chris Walby passed the baton to the next Chris who invented words. And that was one of the things I liked listening to was you just kind of wouldn't know what next word would come your way. And like James, you'd kind of think, gosh, like when you sat down to watch TSN and the pregame show, you'd have to bring a dictionary with you because you'd want to check to see. You kind of like in your mind, you go, I don't think that's a word. I mean, not that I know them all. I'm reasonably good with the language, but I'm sure I don't know them all. But I doubt that that's really a word. And then you'd go to your dictionary, and sure enough, it wasn't there, and it was just another Chrisism. And it was again part of the joy of listening to him. But the thing I loved about it was his love of the game, and the way he talked about the players and the passion he had for their successes. It came through in everything that he did. And then there's that other element of Chris's life, which was his sense of community. And he will forever be synonymous with the Tackle Hunger program. Chris and Tackle Hunger will always be two things that go hand in hand. And he made a difference in so many people's lives. But when you know Chris, as you obviously all did, and you understand the depth of commitment Chris had to the program. It didn't work just because Chris would show up because he had to or was asked to support Tackle Hunger. Chris put his heart and his soul in, and you could see the evidence of the effect that Chris had on people's lives through that one program. And again, it almost became Chris's thing, that Chris was out helping people. And I think for so many reasons, it's one of the things that we'll always be so proud of, having got a chance to know Chris, was to see that depth of his sense of community and his commitment to those who were less fortunate than he was. And that is something that, again, I think is so remarkable about the man. I only played 2 seasons with Chris, but in the last 9 days, I've had this feeling that I played with Chris my entire career because the memories just are so rich and deep. And you think about some of the things that we were able to laugh about. I think Chris was especially happy the day that Ellis Rainsberger, our offensive line coach in those seasons, punch Dan Ferroni in the stomach during a game. I think that we would all, if Chris was here, he'd love to hear that story. And in fact, if I could bring it back, I would have Coach Rainsberger here and Ferroni here and Chris here, and I'd have the coach punch punch Dan all over again to bring the flood of memories. But look, I think it is safe to say that Chris was a remarkable person. He had a remarkable impact on all of us. He had a remarkable impact on the game of football. He had a remarkable impact on the people that he interacted with. So again, to Monica and Mark, on behalf of the entire Canadian Football League family, please know that your brother was a remarkable person and he will be missed. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Grateful you could be here today. Before I ask Pinball to come up, I just have one more story, if you'll indulge me. And I wrote it, but I want to read it because I want to do it justice. It's my favorite Chris Schultz story. And it's not about his big heart, which was so big, and all the kindness. And it's not about his excellence on the football field, which was there, or even as a broadcaster. It's a wonderful act of fate that I will always remember. And it goes like this. Of all the working relationships I've seen involving Chris Schultz, the one I will remember most was the one he had with my good friend Dennis Barham, a TSN senior producer who oversees all our NFL coverage. Dennis and another dear friend who's here, Mark Millett, worked on just about every Super Bowl Chris ever went to, and they took care of him on every assignment like he was their big brother and little brother all at the same time. Dennis stressed about every little detail about our Super Bowl coverage, and that includes Schultzy. And Schultzy cared about him too. I'm sure he would have done anything for Dennis, and by sheer accident, which was just so Schultzy, he gave Dennis the best day of his professional life. Dennis, you see, is the biggest fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers I know. He may be the biggest fan of any team in any sport that I know. Absolute passion. And 12 years ago, we were in Tampa for the Super Bowl 43, and the Pittsburgh Steelers were there to play the Arizona Cardinals. This is a great assignment in every way. James and I have been blessed to cover several of them, and you certainly don't dare complain because it's wonderful. But there's one thing that always did annoy me about it, and that was the inability to really study the end of the game, sometimes the most important part of the game. Because in order to be ready to go on the field after it's over, TV crews that are going live on the field had to be paraded from the media room to underneath the stadium, where you watch the final 5 minutes, if you're lucky, on a small TV. The game that year was so close, and Dennis, in addition to carrying all the stress of our live post-game show, was stressing over his Steelers as well, because it was a close game. And he wanted to get down to the entrance, down in the bowels of the stadium as fast as we possibly could, or hopefully we'd be lucky enough to watch the end of the game on a television and be ready to go. Well, as the massive line of media moved along, he looked back and he said to me, "Where's Schultzy?" And I said, "Well, he's right." You know, I've misplaced a lot of things in my life. I've misplaced car keys. I've misplaced my wallet, my train of thought. I've never misplaced anything. He was 6'8", 300 pounds before. So I was feeling bad. But Dennis didn't even have time for an apology because this was stressful. We got to go on the field soon. And he was furious, not so much at me, but just the situation. Where is Schultzy? So he took off looking for him. Now, there are certain perks. If you're looking for something that's 6'8", there's a better chance than average you're going to find him. And he did find him. He found him in a different line. He was standing near Biff Henderson. Remember Biff Henderson of David Letterman fame? You know, The Late Show, part of that crew? Well, Biff was down there to do probably something comical, and he probably had VIP credentials. So Biff is in a different line. And I don't know how Schultzy ended up in that line, but he did. And Dennis reaches him, exasperated, and is grabbing him like, "Come on, let's go. We got to go here." And just as he did, you know, a security guard yelled at them, "Just, you two, here, this way, to follow Biff Henderson's group." So they did. And they went right into the stadium, field level. Fourth quarter, Super Bowl, featuring Dennis's favorite team while the game is still going on. And they ended up near Arizona's goal line. And they're standing beside Joe Namath, the MVP of Super Bowl III, who was there to present the Lombardi Trophy. Their credentials didn't allow for this. This shouldn't have happened. But there they were, to Dennis's amazement, I'm sure, as the Steelers down, the Cardinals had gone ahead, and the dramatic drive led by Ben Roethlisberger, down the field they come towards them. And they're down at that sideline, I think it was Arizona sideline, and their kicker is nearby and just staying loose. And they witness Roethlisberger to Santonio Holmes and the winning touchdown right on the sideline. And I think of that moment and what I would have paid to be able to just witness the look on Dennis's face, standing there and seeing his team win the Super Bowl in the final seconds. Joe Namath, one of the most unlikely stories in football history, standing beside Dennis Barham, who just witnessed probably the most unlikely moment he could ever imagine, and his giant of a friendly analyst, his good friend who'd inadvertently given him the biggest gift of his professional life. I will always remember that. And Schultz, as we talked about too, had a gift. As much as he prepared, you could bring him, as I did once, to a high school football team with no notes. He wasn't even ready, and he lit the place on fire. He had that kind of passion that I had chills just listening to him. There's one other person I can think of who does that for me as well, who can fire everyone up, and is just such a wonderful speaker. And he was a teammate of Chris's, and they won a Grey Cup together in 1991. And it's my great pleasure now, our final speaker, Michael Pinball Clemens.
Thanks so much, Rod. Is Paul Mazzotti here? Paul, I'm going to ask you to come up right at the end and tell a story about Schultz, one with a little humor. And we call this an audible. And I do prefer to stand up like James Duffy and just let it go. I'm not a notes guy, but today it's not my responsibility to have you hear my voice. It's my responsibility to have you hear our voice. And so have some notes here that I'm going to struggle through, so I'll warn you from the beginning, and then I'm going to have my cleanup guy come and give us a little humor. He is so wonderful at delivering those messages, and there are so many to entertain. But as I start, not did he die, but how did he live? Not what did he gain, but what did he give? These are the units to measure the worth of a man as a man, regardless of his birth. Not what was his church, nor what was his creed, but what had he befriended, but had he befriended those who were in need? Was he ever ready with words of good cheer to bring back a smile, to banish a tear? Not what did the sketch in the newspaper say, but how many were sorry when he passed away. I want to say, first of all, to the family, I usher condolences from the Toronto Argonauts, from TSN and the TSN family, from Pure Later, and from so many more, both in and outside of the game. May you find comfort in knowing that your friends share your grief in this time of sorrow. And sorrow it is. The lovely Krista Bezos has tried so hard to keep us together, and we recently had an opportunity to review again the 91 Grey Cup and have a reunion, and that was just only a couple of weeks ago, and she sent out several messages since then, and the last one she sent said, "Sad news." That was 9 days ago, and the news traveled quickly the following day. And the praise, though, was generous. It was prevalent and unanimously positive. But can I remind you the last stanza of that poem? Not what the sketch in the newspaper say, but how many were sorry he passed away. Here are some personal anecdotes from the emails with the subject line, "Sad news." This one from the ever vicarious and brimming with confidence, Carl Brazley, who said that when he retired, this guy who was the life of the party all the time, he was the guy. He had so much charisma, right? So much mojo. He was a defensive back, and he had to cover the glory guys. You know, those are the receivers, the pretty boys, right? And he had to cover those guys, and those guys had all kind of antics that they would use if you caught a pass on them. When he caught a pass, or when one of those guys caught a pass on him, they just gave the ball back to the referee, because they knew that if they tried to do anything that would suggest they were better, then it was going to be a long day for them. But when he retired, his confidence had waned. He hadn't achieved all he wanted to do in the game. And in transition, he had many different ideas. He's an idea guy, and he's got 35 today, no doubt, right? But he really wasn't sure where he was going and what direction he was going. And he said that Chris Schultz, he wrote him a letter. He told him about the difference that he made in his life. He spoke to him of the things that he learned from him and how he made him a better person. And that vote of confidence from the big man made all the difference in the world. And what I like to call the greatest gap in sports. That greatest gap in sports is that point in which you when you are as comfortable at something you're doing outside of the game as you were inside of the game. And that gap never evaporates for some. Some never. And many never become as comfortable outside of the game as they were inside. Schultz facilitated that for the guy with the most charisma in our locker room. There was a message from our leader, Coach Rita. And for him, he was like a son. Then there was Dan Ferroni. You know, Dan and Schultz, well, they were right beside each other. They were the left guard and the left tackle. They played adjacent to one another, and both were A-type personalities. Both had very strong opinions, and they didn't always get along. But what Dan Ferroni had to admit is that Schultz made him better. There was the nasty man, Paul Nastasiak, whose introduction to Schultz was as abrupt as mine. And I won't tell you my story. You probably heard it already anyway. But the first time that Nasty had just arrived to the team, and he made the mistake of bumping into Schultz. He was a fullback, so he's the guy behind, and he came and he interfered with Schultz when he was making a block, and he apprised him of the merits of doing that again at any time in your life. and so with that, it's amazing because, Nasty also reflected that his relationship evolved to the point that, they'd have sleepovers. He'd come up to Barry and have a few suds and stay the night. Ian Beckstead, the center on that offensive line, reflected on a picture in the sandbox when his oldest son was still a toddler. Schultz, 6'8", and his little guy in the sandbox in their backyard. And Bobby Skimp. Bobby was probably the last player to speak to him. He had spoken to him the week before, and why? Well, Schultz was just calling to check in, just to see how he was doing. He had the perfect body. He had the perfect name, Schultz! Woohoo! And all the tools to play the game. But wait, what made him good was how hard he worked. What made him great was how much he cared. No greater representation of that than little Jason Calero. Jason Calero, I called him little because he's the only guy in our organization that's smaller than me. Not by much. But Jason is a young guy that everybody loves. They call him Suey. No explanations there. But in high school, little Jason was, I don't get a chance to say that out. Can I say that again? Little Jason. In high school, he wanted to play football, and he got bullied. They actually stuffed him in a locker. Danny Webb, our trainer, somehow got the message, and he brought him out to help as an equipment person and help facilitate in working with the guys. And in so doing, Schultz was often the last person to leave the stadium. And I think sometimes Danny wanted to just give him the keys and say, you lock up. But he'd stay until he was done and he was finished. And he would often end up giving Jason a ride home or a ride to the train station. Or every once in a while, there was a restaurant they would go to on a Friday night. experience in watching how he found the best in people. And then on top of that, always had the time, the capacity, the space to help move people along. That's who he was. And for Jason, the guy who got bullied, now had a friend who is the biggest guy in the city. You're right. When I first saw him, I said, man, that's a big brother. I had a little bit more twang then. I still have a little twang now, but I had a little bit more then than I do now, and that's a big brother. And I was exactly right. He is a big brother. The offensive line is the most closely knit group on almost any football team. And if it isn't, you're in trouble. But they're a group that stays together. And when you look at that offensive line from left to right, it was Schultz, then Dan Ferroni, Ian Beckstead, and Bobby Skimp. And then there was the K-Man, Kelvin Prunster. There were a couple of other guys that were really important there as well. There was Jimmy Car Crash, as they would say intimately. Jim Kardash is his actual name, and a principal today, but at that time he ran down the field as an offensive lineman so swiftly. It was almost like a receiver running downfield. And then there was Blaine Schmidt. We called him Bundy. If you've ever seen him, you know why. Chris Green was another young guy on the roster who was the backup. And I was going to try to represent this, but I thought it was best to read this particular reply. And my phone is doing something I've never seen it do. And all right. You think you can figure out how to? Yes. So that was. Sorry for the backhanded tribute there, but I wanted to. Yeah, thank you so much. Good. So I didn't think I could do this justice. So instead, I am simply going to read the words of the other bookend, Kelvin Prunster. You know, there's a tackle on one side and a tackle on the other, and they're often referred to as the bookends. But these guys weren't that just in saying. They lived it. Fighting back the tears, I write this from my home in California. A text in the middle of the night is never going to be good news, but this one really hurts. Jason delivered it. Jason delivered the heartbreaking news: we lost Schultz, our comrade, our friend, and seemingly invincible, larger-than-life figure who had an impact on all of our lives. This is just hard to process. We played together for many years, had so many memories, so many great seasons. We roomed together, worked out together, shared so many big games and Grey Cups, number 66 and number 67. We were the bookends for all those great years. Chris was one of a kind, a great teammate, an enormous talent on the field and off. As a player, he did things on the field I could only marvel at. And on camera, he was a star. He could effortlessly articulate his love and passion for the game, but perhaps what we will miss most about our friend is how much he cared. He cared about his Argonaut brothers, and he let us all know he made us all better. I will always remember Chris's enormous talent, his work ethic and wholehearted dedication, his big heart, humor, and infectious laugh. I will never forget the good times we shared and the support we gave each other. And knowing the glances in the huddle and those big games, the moments that said, "We got this." And most of all, the many laughs we had. We spoke occasionally, but not enough, and often planned to get together. But as is always sadly the case, we never made enough time, thinking there is always tomorrow. I wish we had. The last time we spoke, I was checking in on him after his father's passing. But his only concern was for our struggling teammates. That was Schultz. Chris impacted our lives in many ways. We're all better for knowing him. With a heavy heart, I say goodbye. God bless and Godspeed to my friend. And I did it again. I read that because I really wanted to have the family hear not my voice, but the voices of a team who had a leader they never called leader, who had a friend who many of us didn't realize until the years went by. Why? Because he was the one who called. A lot of guys we hung out with. But he was the guy who followed up. If I could, I would like to share a little story before I close. It's about a little girl who had leukemia and she needed a blood transfusion. And they couldn't find anyone that was a match. And until they tested his little brother, he was only around 5 years old, and they had to try to explain what was going to take place. He didn't really know what a blood transfusion was, but they had to try to explain what it was. And in so doing, they said, what's going to happen is, and they were trying to tell the young guy, is that we're going to, and as they were explaining to him, the little boy is just nodding his head and nodding his head, and he's nodding his head. And they said, he says, so you understand? Are you okay with this? And he says, no, I don't understand. But if it'll save my sister, I'll do it. And The day was said to be one of those miraculous days as the blood was going from the little boy's vein to his sister's vein. They said you could almost see the color coming back to the little girl's face right before their eyes. And it was amazing. You know, the process had gone a little bit, but now you could actually begin to see the color coming back to her. And the little boy looked concerned, and they went over and say, "Hey, listen, your sister's going to be fine." And they went away, and they noticed that he was still frowning, and they said, your little sister's going to be okay. She's going to be fine. And he says, I know, that's great. He said, well, why are you frowning? He said, well, can you tell me, when will I begin to die? See, the little boy didn't quite understand what they were communicating to him. He thought that he had to give all of his blood to his little sister in order to save her. But you remember what he said? If it'll save her, I'll do it. Life itself, in large part, is predicated upon what you're willing to give. For Ian Beckstead, Chris gave him time. For Carl Brazley, he gave him encouragement. For Jason Calero, he gave him family. For Nasty Man, he gave him camaraderie. Don Moen played his last game the same day as Chris. They walked off together. And as he reflected, he actually went back to the death of Warren Hudson. Chris was there almost as much as the family themselves. That's another former player. And then there was Doran Major, who was my best friend. He died. Chris was there. As soon as he found out every day, he was there. Bobby Skimp, he was a friend. But this wasn't just with his friends. With Pure Later Courier, we could see that anybody in need, and Chris Schultz, you found a friend. For me, first time he met me, didn't know who I was, and I've got a different memory of this. I thought that he actually asked me to get him a towel because he thought I was so other people remember it differently, but I either way, it never bothered me. What he gave me was respect. Chris wouldn't want me to cry. So I'm going to end with a quote and hopefully offer you a laugh by way of my good buddy Paul Mazzotti. Today I was chored with giving you a message from us so that you could hear our voice. There's a quote that says, the heart of a champion is not just about what you've won or what you've done. It's an attitude. It's a way of life. It's how you live and what you stand for. It's the foundation for your whole life and existence. The heart of a champion, in fact, is not just something you have. It's something You are Chris Schultz. You are a champion.
Thank you, Michael. Were you gonna? Okay. Were you gonna? Paul Mazzotti, okay. I wasn't sure.
I wasn't sure I was going to come up here either, but talk about an audible. Chris Schultz, intimidated in front of a microphone. I know how he feels following professional broadcasters at Mike Pinball Clemens without preparation. All right. Thought about what I could say is, I looked at my socks just before I came up here and I realized one's inside out, so I thought I had two different socks on. And I said, well, that must have been Schultz looking down on me, because sometimes his pick of wardrobe wasn't exactly the best. The trench coat and the high-cut Converse wasn't exactly the best look. Chris, he was an intimidating guy, and Mike talked about the email chain. And my wife said, did you put anything on the email chain? And I said, no, I haven't yet. I was just a young guy, and I'm waiting for everybody else to respond, because Chris expected it that way. He felt you needed to deserve what you achieved. So I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I still haven't responded because I haven't heard from the Mike Clemens or the Matt Dunnigans. So I'm still waiting my turn, Chris, and I'll probably respond a little later. But Chris opened up his arms to me in a way where, as a financial advisor many moons ago, I'm no longer one now, but he entrusted me with his money. And to me, it was a great gesture. But the funny part is he never knew what it was in. He really didn't care. And he would come in and try to sell me on his pyramid schemes or his currency pyramid schemes in Uganda and things like that. So I was like, Chris, we should probably be a little bit more conservative than that. And it's probably still there, so you may want to check into it, actually. So he made all kinds of money, but he really didn't care about it, and that's who he was. And then I think I fell out of graces. And Mike, I think you fell out of graces with him as well when we became general manager and director of player personnel and president of the Argonauts. And of course, he hated us because we didn't deserve it, he felt. We weren't prepared. And it was a just criticism at the time. And then, of course, when we either got fired and then, I don't know, you came back for some reason. Boom, we were back in the good books. So in the reunion, 25 years for 1991, we were right back in the good books because, we were no longer the general manager and president of the Argonauts. He also didn't understand why we like to golf or fish. He's like, why would you hit a tiny little white ball and chase it all over the place? And then fishing, of course, he just didn't understand why we would catch a fish and then go on and on about the pretty colors. Oh, look at the pretty colors. And then why we would put it back in the water after we would spend all that money and all that time trying to catch fish. So to Schultz, he had his quirks and his different way about going things, but he was a beautiful, beautiful man. And I wish I could feel his handshake one more time and a big hug from him. Thanks so much for the time, Rod.
Thanks, Paul. And a great audible there, Pinball. We're at the end now of what's been such an important day for all of us. Monica, would you like to come up and say a few more words? Okay.
Thank you, everybody. When I sat down multiple times to write this tribute to Chris, I kept getting overwhelmed and found it very difficult to write because of the emotional impact of trying to do justice to him, to do justice to all that he was, all that he accomplished, and what turned out to be a short life, all that he gave to others. I've lost a very important part of me, Marcus lost a very important part of him. Literally and figuratively, Chris left some pretty big shoes behind to fill. Collectively, there are likely thousands of stories of Chris to be shared, and I am sure all of them share a same theme. Chris was kind. Chris was a gentle soul. Chris helped so much. Without Chris, I don't know what I would have done. Chris was to all of you what Chris was to us. He was thoughtful, generous, funny, compassionate, sometimes frustrating, but always our brother. What you may not have known and have heard a little bit today is that despite his size and his physicality and his presence, he was also extremely sensitive and very, very private. Just in the last few days, as I mentioned, Mark and I have learned about our brother Chris, things that we knew, but we didn't really know, if that makes sense. Chris walked his talk. He did what he advocated for. He spoke of strength, and he was strength. He spoke of preparation. He was always prepared. And he spoke of kindness and showed it in so many ways. There are thousands of thank yous to be said. Thank you to Bill Lane for being the catalyst for Chris to get into Arizona. Thank you to the Gilpatricks for being Chris's billet family and taking care of him in Arizona. Thank you to Mark's wife, Ruth, for taking care of him and providing him home-cooked meals. Thank you to Mary Ellen, who was with Chris for this last year. Mary Ellen has said it so well. Setting the bar high was his way. He was magic. Thank you to Rod Smith, Mike Hogan, James Duthie, Randy Abrosi, and Mike Clemens for speaking today, helping us to celebrate Chris's life. Thank you to the Argonaut organization for your support and love of Chris as well, your kind words. Thank you to the family at TSN, again, for all your support over the last while, your kind words. I want to also extend a thank you to Paul Graham. Paul, you gave Chris everything, and you supported him, you held him accountable, and you loved him, and we thank you for that. I can't tell you how much we've enjoyed not only hearing these stories, but feeling your genuine love and caring and affection that you've had for Chris, and we kind of don't want that to end. We want to know more about our brother from you, and we want to keep hearing about his stories, his Schultziisms. We have set up an email, and if you care to share a story with us, we'd love to read your Schultzy stories. The email is schultzystories@gmail.com, and we can't wait to read them. Chris was many things to many people. He was many things to his country and his community. He was many things to his friends and his teammates. The words you've heard, legend, icon, analyst, professional, dedicated, determined, a man of character, and so much more have all been used over and over to describe Chris. And all of them are true. But the best of them all, Chris was a brother. In a sense, over the last few years, Chris has come full circle and kind of come back to us as a brother, not as a team player with the Argonauts, not as a broadcaster with TSN. During the visitations this week, someone who we had never met came to the visitation and met with Mark and I. She came just to tell us a story of a random encounter she had with Chris and a spontaneous conversation that they had, at which time Chris said to her, "Siblings are your team. They know your whole story." And Mark and I know Chris's whole story, and we've been privileged to learn even more and know more now. I personally think Chris sent her to Mark and I just to let us know that he thought of us as his team and that he was still around. Today, we say goodbye to our team member. When you walked in, you received a packet, and some of you may be going, "What the heck is this?" Because it's kind of a little weird. But as you see, Chris was a master of preparation and was known for his distaste in technology. He was old school, wrote all things out in black Sharpie, and used a collection of highlighters. His buddies of TSN have told you all about that. You will see in the packet that you have a black Sharpie in honor of Chris, and you also have a highlighter or a colored Sharpie. I'm going to let you know that the highlighters and colored Sharpies came straight off his desk. It's a little bit of us to give to you, just a little memento. The world was a better place because Chris was here. It was a better place because he made it a better place with his actions, his words, and most of all, his heart. It was a better place because he believed in people and he believed in all things good. Let's continue to honor Chris and make the world a better place, to not let the spirit and soul of who Chris was go. Let's keep his legacy of kindness and paying it forward alive by using those black Sharpies. Write a letter to someone you have lost touch with. Use the black Sharpie to write a note to someone who needs a little encouragement. Use the black Sharpie to sign a card for someone you love and let them know how you feel. If one thing the sudden unexpected departure of Chris has again taught us is you just never know when your last moment is. Don't let it pass without saying the words. Chris was a huge supporter and representative for the Pure Later Tackle Hunger. It spoke to his philanthropic side, as you have heard. Our father had said when he immigrated to Canada from Germany, it was important and hard to get food. We know during these unprecedented times, many people are also struggling to put food on the table. I'd like to motivate you, to inspire you, and to ask you to do what Schultz would do. To make a donation to Pure Later Tackle Hunger in Chris's honor in the amount of $67 for his jersey number, and to continue to make this world a better place, even without him in it. I'm going to conclude with a story that exemplifies my relationship with my brother and his generosity. When Chris let me know in 1994 that it was going to be his last season as an Argonaut and he was going to retire from his professional football career, I made sure I went to every single home game, rain or shine, snow, hail. This is Toronto. I sometimes went with friends and I sometimes went alone. Then, on his last home game ever as an Argonaut, Mark and I were in the stands in the family section. I don't remember who played. I don't remember who won. But what I do remember is it was the end of the fourth quarter with seconds left on the clock. And all of a sudden, Chris turns around and he finds me in the stands. And he catches my eye and he starts doing this. And I'm like going, what's going on? And Chris is like, come here. And Mark even gave me a little push on my back. And so I jumped down the 8-9 rows, and I jumped over the little barrier, and I stepped on the field with Chris. Chris asked me to walk him off the field for his last time, and I did. I couldn't believe he would share that moment with me, that in that moment he thought of me. And now here we are. On March 4th, Chris got his 2-minute warning, and he had no timeouts left. And here I am again, honored to be the one, after his last home game, to again walk him off the field. To you, he was the big man. To me, he will always be my big brother.
And we leave on that note. As Pinball said, Schultz would not want us to cry, and he probably wouldn't have. He was probably too humble to want a day like this. And it's probably the only time that I'm glad to defy him. Say, rest in peace, big man. Thank you for all coming. It's meant a lot to me, and I'm sure it's meant a lot to you. Appreciate it.
That concludes the services here in your home. The family will be making